I have some sad news, everyone. After months of hope and leadership and changing how society as a whole, because we live in a society, how this society is changing. And there have been some bright lights in this dark time. There's been the polyamorous couple who all were acting like vampires and they sucked so much of another person's blood that they all got sick. There's that guy who was like a video game designer in the UK who decides to live like a cat in a castle like a king because he can. It's beautiful. There are signs of hope that we have. And one of those signs of hope has been Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? Talked about her on the last episode. I've talked about her a lot. She's really important, I say she has changed the conversation. Sometimes, it's not good to have heroes or to depend on people who say, I am the light, I am the way. I will show you that new, more perfect union. And of course, I'm talking about that. This is really hard, guys. Again, this is this week she went on a popular YouTuber's charity stream. This guy's called H-Bomber Guy. He's like some video game streamer / like lefty politics guy, I don't have any of those things in common. I don't know what the fuck. I don't know how you can do it. But he was doing this charity for this group that was defunded that like helps kids with like, gender issues and helps give like support to queer youth and especially like trans youth. And he was raising money for them. He ended up raising a lot of money. It was actually great. Who am I kidding? And to help raise money, he got some famous people on. And one of the people who he got on the stream was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I'm 31. I believe she's 29. We're similar age. We're in that sort of mid-millennial age, I guess. Not exactly sure. I'm making up terms. But, again, I'm sad. This is a very sad moment because for this stream, H-Bomber Guy played Donkey Kong 64, which was, if I remember at the time, the most expensive video game, like, to buy. So, in and of itself, there you go. Bourgeois values put onto this. Interesting. But in this interview, Miss Ocasio-Cortez, dear leader, our great Ocasio-Cortez, came onto this stream and said that, okay, this is really hard, that the Nintendo 64 was the best system ever? Are you shitting me? Are you kidding me? The Nintendo 64 was a disaster. The Nintendo 64 basically almost killed Nintendo. It set on the path that almost killed Nintendo. And I'm glad all you people can afford to have a Switch, but the Nintendo 64 was the worst purchase I ever made as a kid. There were like 5 good games. You know what happens when you have only 5 good games? You get fucking bored. I couldn't even have GoldenEye because it was too violent because when you died, all the blood came on the screen. Ocasio-Cortez, you are not representing my ideals when you said the Nintendo 64 was the best. Have you seen that controller? It was so dumb. You already had a good idea for how controllers were with the Super Nintendo. Why'd you fuck it up? Why didn't you use a CD drive? Why did you then require me for the first time in my life have to buy 2 video game consoles? I am really pissed about this, I have to say, guys. This is like when some people, when like a politician, they this is my version of people being mad at Bernie Sanders over Venezuela. Okay? This is Unpopular Front the Podcast. My name is Ben Udashen. Welcome, everybody. I hope that wasn't too laborious. I think it's important, though. I think it's important that, we have politicians who represent our values. I don't know about you. I personally like politicians that represent my values. And obviously in the mid-90s, the best way to play video games was the PC. The second best was the PlayStation. Then it was the Nintendo 64. Come on! Have you all played StarCraft 1? That was incredible! You played Half-Life? It was so good! Metal Gear Solid. You couldn't play any of... I guess you could play StarCraft on the Nintendo. It doesn't matter. I'm back. I'm here. Everyone, hello. Welcome. Have some new music that I think is truly going to be the final theme music by a cool guy who I discovered through the podcast Street Fight Radio. I think he was like a tech guy who then became an EMT. He's like a good sort of anarcho-socialist lefty guy. He does this music that he calls Labor Wave, which is vaporwave, but with like leftist quotes, and I think it's cool. He's called Young Chomsky. The song that you heard is called "It Is Our Duty." That's like has like some Asada Shakur quotes. Look her up. Look up the history of the Black Panthers, and especially Asada Shakur in particular. She's a fascinating person. But anyways, it is the end of January here. I hope everyone is doing fine. If you're on the East Coast, it's supposed to be really cold. I was texting with Benny, and he said it's really cold. And, yeah. So, today on the show, I wanted to talk about a few topics in the news. That's kind of what I always do, right? Do I really need to explain what the show is? Do you need that? Or should I just do it? I think I'm just gonna do it. But, it's been a weird week. I woke up this morning with the news of Roger Stone being arrested as part of the Mueller investigation, which I don't think I've ever actually talked about the Russia investigation, the Mueller investigation on this show, whatever you want to call it. I don't really follow it too much because I just kind of assume that it's like one of those things that like I feel like I have so little control over it. And even like the opinions I could have on it wouldn't really affect like the political situation at all. So I'm just like, there's just other things, I guess, that I just, there's just so many things to worry about, and it doesn't really, like, I believe that stuff's happening. I just don't care enough to like know about it that much. I think a lot of people feel that way, but I think also a lot of people just get enjoyment out of it, like it's an entertainment thing. And there's a whole topic about, like, is it worth sort of like for those kinds of the things that we choose to follow in the news, because there's so many sources of information, there's so much going on, there's so much media that is being produced. Like, choosing what we care about is as much like an aspect of our like political identity and our sense of self as sort of what we're learning, right? And I think for a lot of people, sort of, especially boomers, let's be honest, and maybe a lot of like, I don't know, kind of dorky lib kids. Sorry, like everyone I know, I'm sorry. But that there is this like choice that we make, right? This choice of like, I'm going to watch this and I'm going to care about this. And sometimes those choices are really based off of like what we find entertaining, or what we find like to be like fitting like a nice theory of of like a narrative that we can follow that's fun, but I just don't personally really seem to be that drawn to the specifics of the minutia of the Russia story, right? But that's my like take on that. But Roger Stone rules. He is such a weird, bad dude. I highly recommend the Netflix documentary, Get Me Roger Stone. It is a bizarre look at one of the weirdest men of like with like a lot of power in the conservative movement. He's famous for being a swinger. He's famous for being a little dapper Dan who loves to dress like a steampunk villain, like at the inauguration for Trump. He has a Richard Nixon tattoo on his back. He's a weird guy. He's a really weird guy. So, like, between him and Jerome Corsi getting involved in all this, like, investigation, it's like this generation of, like, boomer, right-wing conservative, sort of semi-conspiracy theory-y, semi-charlatan, I don't know, kind of like right-wing radical. What I don't really know, like, how to explain Roger Stone's politics. If you know how to, send me an email at unpopularfrontmedia.com. unpopularfrontmedia@gmail.com. Google, read them. You got them. Read all those emails. You can probably just release them to the public, Google, if you want, because it's on Gmail. But so Roger Stone is in jail right now, which is funny to me. I feel really bad for his swingers group because I bet he made like a mean old fashioned and knew how to get really good bud, actually. So, God, what a weird fucking world. Apparently, reading a tweet from Aaron Mate of The Real News that is saying, as I said before, Stone had no actual link to WikiLeaks, which is sort of the way that they're bringing him in. He just trolled everyone into thinking that he did, which is totally the Roger Stone like mode. If you watch that documentary, you see just how much of it is just sort of like confidence and bullshitting to sort of just push what he wants, because it's like a merry prankster, but for the worst things. He's now being indicted for lying to Congress, not to Mueller, about his efforts to find out what WikiLeaks had from two people who also had no real link either. So this is going to be quite an interesting story, and I have to say, I'm fucking pumped. Like, it's, you know, like, when I hear about, you know, all the little bits, the Steele dossier or whatever the fuck with the Russia investigation, I don't really care. But when you have a fucking weirdo, like, monster, like Roger Stone, now I kind of care. So who knows, maybe I'm going to start watching MSNBC. Russia, Russia, Russia. Another bit of news that happened this week was Elizabeth Warren announced a wealth tax as part of her policy platform in her run for president. I'm reading from The Intercept by David Dayen. Elizabeth Warren proposes annual wealth tax on ultra-millionaires. Now, ultra-millionaires makes them sound a little too cool. Speaking of the Nintendo 64, the Nintendo 64 was the Ultra Nintendo Entertainment System for a while, but then they changed it, and that's when it all went wrong. Regardless, Warren's plan would shrink the wealth of the super rich by $2.75 trillion over a 10-year period, while only affecting about 75,000 U.S. households. Now, I'm not a math expert. I did do better on my math SATs than I think my life would show, but still not a math expert. I cannot do that quickly. But if you divide that, and I'm not going to, guys, I'm not going to divide it. If you sort of think about the amount of people that maybe live in the city that you live in, 75,000 households is like, I don't know, I'm going to say like 200,000 people. That's like smaller than some suburbs. Just think about that. Think about how few people that is in the grand scheme of America. And first off, it's not even taking that much. Her plan would, the ultra-millionaire tax, as Warren's campaign describes it, would impose a 2% annual tax on households' net worth of all dollars above $50 million. So, we've been talking a lot, thanks to AOC, that traitor who doesn't know the power of the PlayStation and the PC in the mid-90s. Come on! But as AOC has helped bring into the national conversation, bringing back the very, very moderate 70% marginal tax rate over $10 million, this would do a tax on wealth. So the AOC plan is a tax on income, meaning for all the money you earn in that year, this would be a 2% tax each year. And then there would be an additional 1% surtax to kick in above those with over $1 billion in income. This is not a lot of money, actually. Like 2%. Think about that. 2% of $100 million is $2 million. But think about that. You would have $96 million left. I don't know about you guys, but I understand, maybe some people work really, really hard. But also, a lot of this wealth, particularly wealth, is not from people working hard. Like, for instance, like, I'm going to be honest, I get some money from an estate that my grandfather had. He had 6 kids and 20 plus grandkids. So it's spread out a lot, And I think about that and that's money that, I didn't do anything for it. I was literally born into it. And a huge percentage of that kind of wealth is just an extraordinarily larger version of that. Wealth is one of the core drivers of inequality. I powered my way through that Thomas Piketty book. He's French, so I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. Maybe I'll call Ari. The way that sort of the Great Compression, as it's called in the U.S., or the Belle Epoque in France after World War II, one of the reasons why we were able to have these flourishing social democracies and these, booming economies and, greater social equalities being made possible with this economic base was the fact that we had incredibly high tax rates for the wealthy, and the distance between the greatest holders of wealth and the average worker were so much smaller than it is now. And in that book, he goes through tons of economic data. It's a lot of graphs and shit, graphs and shit, And what he comes out with based off of this data is the idea that we need an international tax on wealth. And that there's a certain point where just so much wealth there's no social good in it. And what it does is it just constricts and reconfigures politics and the economy to revolve around such different needs and such different interests than the average person. Policies like an international wealth tax should be the goal with how we think about taxing wealth and how we think about, making a better society. So go on, Sister Warren. You got it on this one. I wanted to end this week's episode on a subject that I'm going to admit I don't really know a lot about. I don't really interact with people from Venezuela that much. I don't really interact with anything from Venezuela. But I know that doing a coup there is probably wrong, right? This week, after years of crisis and very crippling and completely unnecessary, and let's be honest, sanctions are violence, just like bombing. It appears that there is a coup being attempted or happening in Venezuela right now. The U.S. and allies have just decided, besides France, actually, I don't think France has gone in yet, which is interesting, probably because they have their own bit of a legitimacy problem. 17% for Macron approval rating. But right now, there is an attempted coup happening in Venezuela. And, there's so many sources you could go to that could go deeper into how, certain institutions probably aren't responding in ways that you would want them to. I'm not seeing a lot of liberals really saying a lot, but also, I realize, I kind of have my own little leftist bubble. Maybe that's happening. And also, there's someone else that can tell you that story way better than me. But what I really want to really focus on sort of for how we as just sort of normal working people can relate to something like sanctions in Venezuela, and sort of how that aspect clouds so much of the conversation with how we're going to be talking about it, and how sort of this idea of legitimacy will be created for whoever the new president is. We just called someone and said they're the president. You can just sort of just do that. If enough people say that, and you have enough money and you have enough guns, you just get to do that. And I guess what I want to say is I am now the president of my block. This is my block. I am the legit leader. And you know the reason why I can say that? There's no other houses on my block because I live in a weird place. I am the president of my block. There will be interstate commerce. There will be international travel. I will get food delivered to my country. But that's what I am. I'm a sovereign citizen. See how that's like super dumb? That's basically what's happening there. But there's also a really challenging conversation being had that's not that stupid joke. There's the fact that, first off, Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves. So that really, as we think about, let's say, a few American adventures in the past decade, let's say, decades that have happened, you think about maybe there might be a continuum, let's say. But there's been a lot of confusion, even among sort of leftist, about sort of how do we handle something like the Maduro government? Because it's so hard to know sort of where is it, where are these choices and these policies that are happening? Where are they sort of the impact of things like economic sanctions and a like strategic like play on the oil markets to basically help wreck Venezuela's economy, because so much of their economy is based on oil. That like strategically helped other people in the oil business. And also just how corrupt oil is in general. It's just like a deeply corrupt, it just breeds corruption. Look at countries literally all over the world. It's like the second you're like cursed with it, like you hear about that I think in Nigeria, or just it almost doesn't matter sort of where the country is or how it goes. Once you have that level of wealth and riches that can be had, it's just rife for corruption, regardless of the kind of economic system that's in place. And that's a huge problem, by the way. I'm not saying that as an excuse. I'm saying that maybe that's a reason to get off of fossil fuels. But these economic sanctions have really constricted the possibility for a country like Venezuela to be able to have the more just society. And there's no doubt that, they attempted a coup on Hugo Chavez in 2002. Like, there has definitely been American influence in Venezuela that has made the project of the Bolivarian Revolution, which is the revolution that was led by Hugo Chavez in the late 90s, I think, that basically looked to, honestly, like bring Venezuela into like a more egalitarian, modern society. Like in many ways, it was a great modernizing act of progress. The caste system of Venezuela is something that I didn't know a lot about. I knew about sort of a similar sort of aspect in Mexican history, but I think that's just because, Mexico is a lot closer than to where I was. Like I was growing up in Texas, but I didn't realize this, but I was doing a little bit of Wikipedia-ing, so who knows? Maybe this is 100% wrong, but this doesn't seem like the kind of thing you would lie about on Wikipedia. But I never made the connection that Venezuela is one of the places that Christopher Columbus landed. And in that era of sort of the early sort of Spanish Empire in the Americas, forget sort of how in that time period, and this was almost like this is a huge aspect of American history too, of that there were people who were coming from Europe who were maybe not as high up in the aristocracy there, or they weren't at all, but they were just like soldiers, or they were, certain kinds of craftsmen or farmers who wanted to live like the aristocracy of Spain or of England or of France or of Germany or of Italy. And I realized some of those countries didn't actually exist then. Okay. Prussia and the Lombards or whatever. And part of the promise of settling in the Americas is the fact that, this is a huge aspect of American chattel slavery, but this was very much an aspect in places like Mexico and Venezuela, sort of with the, with the mestizo population and the native groups, that there was basically a chance to recreate a feudal world just in the Americas with cheap labor, with, all this, quote, free land. It wasn't really free land. And it also, obviously, it wasn't discovered by them either. But, and that a lot of these systems, they aren't exactly the same as American history with chattel slavery. Mainly because instead of, oh God, it's shitty history, but instead of importing African people, it just kind of enslaved the native people. So, these inequalities and in this culture, in the history of the land that is Venezuela, is something that the Bolivarian Revolution was trying to finally overthrow. I'm not saying that in the 80s and the 70s, Venezuela was was like that weird British guy who dresses up like a king. But the racial caste systems that were sort of built into the economy are a big reason why we on the left, and honestly, if you believe in multiculturalism, you cannot just go full in we got to overthrow, we got to go back. Because the state of life for a lot of in indigenous communities and poor people in Latin America. This is similar in Venezuela, in Brazil with Lula, in the whole sort of pink tide movement. Was it moved people from a peasant state, in a not doing well peasant state either, to a modern semi-social democratic basis of care and of resources and of food. It really helped equalize society in some of these places. And I think it's important that we put that into consideration. I'm not an expert on it. I'm going to try to read this George Ciccarello Marr book that I bought on the Verso book sale about it. So hopefully I'll be more informed. A lot of the forces that are, helping empower this coup, they don't really care about them. A lot of these people were the people who were trying to uphold the status quo in the first place, that kept a lot of people in a near peasant state. And we can complain about kleptocracy, which I'm sure is true to a degree, because again, oil, and because again, sanctions, and because again, probably some shitty choices, there's all these things. But Maduro is not the reason why, and it seems from my reading, he's a lot worse than Chavez. But the focus has to be on respecting democracy. Bring in people to watch the voting. Do what you got to do that, and lifting sanctions, because sanctions are inherently violent. When I was thinking about sanctions and how sort of in a sense of like, okay, I'm trying to relate to this and like, how would that be for me? And then I realized something that a lot of us are going to be dealing with for, I think everyone's going to deal with this in some way because it's going to really affect the economy negatively, is all the student loan debt that's being held. And it's kind of like these sanctions are like, think about the impact of that on your life, listener, who probably has a few $1,000s at a minimum in student loan debt. Think about all the choices and all the things you cannot do because of that money. Now think about that, but it's just on everything. And it's a lot more. And it's really restrictive of the possibility of what could happen. And that's kind of what these sanctions are like. So, again, I'm very strongly pro-internationalist. I think there's a bit of a tinge of like nationalist leftism that I hear about. And I can't. It's bullshit. I'm sorry. That's wrong. And it's bad politics. When we sort of see how these sort of things can affect us, or in how there are these weights that are put on us because of the way that, the economies are formed, that is just like a huge reason why we cannot support these sanctions. They are limiting all of this chance for like so much possibility of so many people being lifted out of poverty. Like there's so many things that could happen, or they could, we could help find ways for Venezuela to structure their economy that's beyond oil, even. Like if instead of restricting them and closing them off, of course, I say that and I'm thinking about it. I'm like, oh God, they're going to turn into like a coding factory or something. I don't know how helpful that is either. But, there are these huge opportunities for human flourishing and like real political power. And also like for nonviolent demonstrations of democratic will. Hands off Venezuela. This has been Unpopular Front, the podcast. My name is Ben Udashen. You can follow me on Twitter at BENUDASHEN. Subscribe to the podcast on every platform available. iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, RSS. This should be available on all your podcast streaming platforms. Thanks to Young Chomsky for letting me use some of the cool Labor Wave for our theme music. You can, if you like the show, share it with a friend. For the Left and Loud, I'm Ben Udashen.